At 6:22 in the morning, Tehran time, a convoy of unmarked vehicles slipped out of the back entrance of a government compound in the northern district of the Iranian capital. No announcement was made. No state television cameras were positioned to record it. The Revolutionary Guard units that normally flank official motorcades were conspicuously absent. And the man who was supposed to be inside one of those vehicles, the individual the Islamic Republic had spent the better part of 2 years carefully positioning as the heir to the most powerful unelected position in the Middle East, was not seen publicly for what would become days. And then longer than days. What you are about to hear is not speculation dressed up as analysis. This is a reconstruction of events, corroborated by multiple sourced reports, diplomatic cables that have been referenced in regional press, and the observable behavior of the Iranian state itself in the hours and days that followed. Because sometimes the most revealing thing a government does is not what it says. It is what it suddenly, and very deliberately, stops saying. Iran's Islamic Republic has survived for over 4 decades by mastering one particular political art, the management of silence. It controls its narrative with extraordinary discipline. State media does not go quiet by accident. Officials do not cancel scheduled appearances without cause. And when the machinery of the most centralized theocratic state in the world begins to malfunction in public, even slightly, it is almost always because something far more significant is happening behind the walls that the rest of the world cannot see. So when the man widely understood to be Iran's next supreme leader, the figure the establishment had been quietly grooming to inherit the mantle of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who himself is in his mid-80s and in declining health, when that man effectively disappeared from public view without explanation, and when the Iranian government responded not with a statement, not with a denial, not with a reassuring press conference, but with a silence so complete it felt architectural, the world's intelligence agencies, regional governments, and geopolitical analysts all arrived at the same unsettling conclusion. Something had gone wrong inside the Islamic Republic. And nobody was certain how wrong. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the succession question means for Iran and for the entire region. The position of supreme leader in the Islamic Republic is not comparable to any Western political office. It is not the presidency. It is not a cabinet role. The supreme leader sits above all elected institutions. He commands the Revolutionary Guard. He controls foreign policy. He has final authority over the nuclear program, over relations with proxy forces across the Middle East, over the judiciary, over the state broadcaster. In the theology of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader is the deputy of the hidden imam on earth. This is not metaphor. This is constitutional doctrine. Khamenei has held that position since 1989. He is the only person alive who has ever held it other than the founder of the Republic, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini himself. And for years now, it has been understood by everyone who watches Iran seriously that the question of who comes next is the most consequential political question not just in Tehran, but across the entire arc of the Middle East. The man who had emerged as the leading candidate, whose name had circulated in diplomatic and intelligence circles with increasing frequency over the past several years, had been positioned with unusual care. Public appearances structured to demonstrate religious credibility. Institutional roles that gave him visibility within the clerical establishment. Quiet endorsements from figures close to Khamenei. The machinery of succession in a theocratic state does not move quickly or loudly, but it does move. And it had been moving in one direction. And then it stopped. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you need to go back further than the past few days. You need to go back at least 18 months, and arguably further than that. Because what is happening now did not emerge from nowhere. It is the culmination of pressures that have been building inside the Islamic Republic for years, pressures that the government has managed to suppress or redirect, but never fully resolve. Begin with the internal politics of the clerical establishment itself. The question of succession has never been simple in Iran, because the Islamic Republic was built on a theological premise, the concept of vilayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the jurist, that requires its supreme authority figure to possess not just political power but genuine religious scholarly credentials. Khomeini had them in abundance. He was among the most senior clerical figures of his generation. Khamenei's elevation in 1989 was, in the eyes of many senior clerics, a compromise, an act of political necessity rather than religious consensus. Khamenei was elevated to the rank of Grand Ayatollah after the fact, which caused significant resentment within the Shia clerical world, particularly in the seminaries of Qom. That resentment never fully dissipated. And as the succession question has moved from theoretical to urgent, the factional tensions within the establishment have intensified. There are clerics who believe the next supreme leader must have unimpeachable religious credentials. There are Revolutionary Guard commanders who believe the next leader must be firmly aligned with the security apparatus and its regional strategy. There are pragmatic politicians who believe the next leader must be someone capable of managing Iran's crippling economic situation. These are not the same person. And in the months before this disappearance, the competition between these factions had reportedly reached a level of intensity not seen since the early years of the Republic. If you are trying to understand why this particular moment was so charged, here is the context you need. Earlier this year, there were credible reports from multiple sources, including Persian-language media outside Iran, which often reports what the domestic press cannot, that the Assembly of Experts, the body constitutionally responsible for selecting the supreme leader, had been convened for closed sessions at a frequency that was itself unusual. The official explanations were bureaucratic. The actual agenda was understood to be the succession. There was pressure coming from within Khamenei's own office to formalize a path before his health deteriorated further. And that pressure was creating friction, because not everyone in the establishment agreed on the destination. Simultaneously, Iran was navigating an external environment of extraordinary complexity. The nuclear negotiations that had resumed with tentative optimism had stalled again, this time more definitively. Sanctions relief, which Tehran had counted on to ease the economic pressure that had been building on the population for years, was not materializing. The currency had continued to decline. Inflation remained at levels that made daily life genuinely difficult for ordinary Iranians. And the protest movements that had erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022 had left a residue in Iranian society that the government had suppressed but not erased. The leadership knew, it would be a mistake to assume otherwise, that the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic was under a different kind of pressure than it had faced before. Previous challenges, in 2009, in 2019, even in 2022, had been met with force. That formula still worked in the short term. But there was a growing awareness within certain factions of the establishment that force alone was not a sustainable answer to a generation that had grown up with internet access, with awareness of how people lived elsewhere, with a level of alienation from the religious ideology of the state that was qualitatively different from the discontents of earlier decades. This is the environment in which the succession drama was unfolding. And this is the context that makes the disappearance of the designated successor so explosive in its implications. The first reports that something was wrong came not from Iranian state media, which said nothing, but from the periphery of the information ecosystem around Iran. A scheduled speech was cancelled. No reason was given. Then a second appearance, at a religious ceremony that would have been significant in terms of the symbolism involved, did not happen. A photograph that had been expected, based on the patterns of previous years, was not released. And then a figure within the clerical establishment, speaking to a regional outlet in a way that was clearly not authorized, used a phrase that set off every alert in every intelligence monitoring center that tracks Iran. The phrase, translated carefully, suggested that the leadership was dealing with an internal matter requiring discretion. In the language of the Islamic Republic, that is extraordinary. That is the kind of language that does not emerge accidentally. Someone said something they should not have said, or said it in a way that was just ambiguous enough to be denied while still being clear enough to be understood. And what it was understood to mean was that the apparent successor was not where he was supposed to be, was not doing what he was supposed to be doing, and that the government was not prepared to explain why. Here is what most people are missing when they try to interpret this situation through a Western political lens. In a democracy, when a senior official disappears from public view, the interpretive framework is relatively constrained. They are ill. They are resigning. They are under investigation. The institutional mechanisms for transition are known and documented. In the Islamic Republic, the interpretive space is far wider and far darker. Because the system operates on the principle that the divine legitimacy of the state must never be seen to waver, any disruption to that appearance of seamless authority is treated as an existential threat. Which means the options available to the system for managing such a disruption include things that democratic systems simply do not contemplate. Let us consider the possible explanations in order of their likelihood and their implications. The first and most benign explanation is a health crisis. Khamenei himself, as we noted, is in his mid-80s and has been reported to have significant health issues over the years, though the government has never confirmed specifics. If the designated successor has suffered a sudden and serious medical event, a stroke, a cardiac incident, something that incapacitated him abruptly, the government's instinct would be exactly what we have observed: silence, delay, and a careful management of information while the establishment figures out how to respond. In a system where the appearance of divine order is politically essential, admitting that the chosen successor is incapacitated before the succession has even formally occurred would be damaging. It would invite questions about whether the choice had been right. It would empower rival factions. This explanation is plausible. It is the explanation that would cause the least geopolitical turbulence if confirmed, though even this scenario carries significant instability risks for a system already under pressure. The second explanation, more serious and more destabilizing, involves internal political conflict that has escalated beyond the point the establishment can contain quietly. There are factions within the Revolutionary Guard, specifically within its intelligence arm, which has operated with significant autonomy under successive commanders, that have reportedly been deeply skeptical of the designated successor. The grounds for that skepticism, as reported through indirect channels, relate to questions of ideological purity, questions of who the successor was seen as aligned with in terms of the factional battles within the establishment, and questions about his approach to the relationship between the clerical establishment and the military apparatus of the state. If that factional conflict has produced a crisis, if an internal power struggle has reached a point of confrontation that is no longer manageable through the normal mechanisms of political patronage and institutional maneuvering, then what we may be witnessing is not an absence but a removal. Not necessarily in the most violent sense of that word. But in a system with the institutional architecture of the Islamic Republic, a removal from succession does not require a bullet. It can be accomplished through an accusation, through a legal proceeding within the clerical court system, through a sudden revelation of something, real or constructed, that makes the designated successor untenable. And the silence that follows would look exactly like what we are currently observing. The third possibility, and the one that intelligence agencies are reportedly treating with the most serious concern, is external interference. Iran's adversaries, and Iran has consequential adversaries, have demonstrated in recent years a willingness and a capability to reach inside Iranian institutions in ways that were previously assumed to be impossible. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020 was the most dramatic demonstration of that capability. But it was not the only one. The killing of nuclear scientists over the preceding decade, carried out in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of movements and security arrangements, demonstrated a penetration of Iranian security that the Revolutionary Guard has never fully resolved. If an external actor, or a combination of external actors, has managed to either physically eliminate the designated successor or to engineer a situation that has forced his removal from the succession process, the implications are almost too large to fully enumerate. Because it would mean that the transition of power in the Islamic Republic, already the most consequential political question in the Middle East, has been directly disrupted by foreign interference. And the Iranian response to that, when it became clear to the leadership what had happened, would not be restrained. Let us talk about the geopolitical stakes for a moment, because they deserve to be stated clearly. Iran is not a peripheral actor in the Middle East. It is the central organizing principle of one of the two major axes of regional power. Its network of proxy relationships, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with various armed factions in Iraq, with the Houthi movement in Yemen, with Palestinian armed groups in Gaza, constitutes the most sophisticated and geographically extensive non-state military network in the world. These relationships are not simply financial. They are strategic, ideological, and deeply personal in terms of the relationships between Iranian commanders and their counterparts in allied organizations. The individual who becomes supreme leader will have direct influence over all of these relationships. Beyond the proxy network, Iran's nuclear program represents one of the most carefully calibrated strategic assets in contemporary international relations. Iran has spent decades, at enormous economic cost, developing a nuclear capability that stops just short of weaponization in a way that gives it leverage without triggering the full consequence of crossing that final threshold. The management of that asset, the decisions about how close to bring it, how to use it as a bargaining chip, when to advance and when to pause, is a supreme leader-level decision. A transition of power that is chaotic or contested or externally disrupted creates a period of ambiguity around that asset that every major power finds alarming. And then there is the domestic dimension, which is inseparable from the geopolitical one. The Iranian population has endured 4 decades of economic mismanagement, international isolation, and political repression. The social contract, such as it is, has been fraying for years. The establishment has maintained its grip through a combination of ideological conditioning, selective benefits for loyal constituencies, and the coercive capacity of the security apparatus. But that grip has required constant management. A succession crisis, particularly one that becomes visible to the public, and in the age of social media and satellite television it is very difficult to keep such things invisible, could accelerate existing social pressures in ways that even the Revolutionary Guard's considerable capacity for repression might struggle to manage. We have historical precedents for what happens when succession crises intersect with popular discontent in authoritarian systems. The parallels are not perfect, because no situation is perfectly analogous to another, but the pattern is recognizable. The Soviet Union in its final years provides one template, a gerontocracy struggling with succession while economic stagnation eroded legitimacy, until the system reached a point where its own reform impulses outran its capacity for control. Cuba's transition from Fidel to Raúl Castro provides a different template, a carefully managed handover that preserved system continuity at the cost of dynamism. North Korea's succession from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un provides a third template, a rapid consolidation around a young and inexperienced heir that produced a period of internal purges before stability was achieved. None of these templates fits Iran precisely. Iran's political system is more complex than any of these comparisons, more theologically legitimized in ways that create both constraints and resources that secular authoritarian systems do not possess. But the underlying dynamic, a powerful state whose legitimacy depends on the performance of seamlessness encountering a situation that disrupts that performance, is recognizable across these cases. What are the regional actors doing right now in response to this situation? Because you can be certain they're not passive observers. Saudi Arabia has been engaged in a carefully managed normalization process with Iran, brokered by China, that began to produce tangible results over the past couple of years. That process was premised on a certain degree of predictability in Iranian behavior. A succession crisis introduces unpredictability of a kind that Riyadh finds deeply uncomfortable. Saudi intelligence will be working to understand what is happening in Tehran with every asset at its disposal. And depending on what they learn, the calculus around that normalization process may shift. Israel's position is more straightforward to characterize if not to navigate. For Israel, any instability in Iran's leadership structure is simultaneously an opportunity and a danger. An opportunity because a system distracted by internal crisis is a system with reduced bandwidth for managing its proxy network. A danger because a system that feels existentially threatened has historically been more, not less, aggressive in its external behavior, particularly when it believes that external actors are responsible for the threat it faces. Israeli intelligence, which has demonstrated extraordinary penetration of Iranian institutions, will be in a position of knowing far more than it is prepared to say publicly. And the decisions being made in Tel Aviv right now are being made with information that the rest of the world does not have. The United States' position is complicated by the political environment in Washington, which has limited the diplomatic bandwidth available for managing a situation of this complexity. American intelligence is certainly aware of what is happening at a level of detail that surpasses what is publicly available. The question for Washington is how to respond in a way that does not inadvertently accelerate Iranian decision-making toward outcomes that would be dangerous, while also not foreclosing options that might become relevant depending on how this situation develops. China, which has made significant investments in its relationship with Iran and which brokered the Saudi-Iranian normalization, has the most immediate and concrete interest in stability. China does not want a chaotic succession in Tehran. It does not want a destabilized Iran that becomes a theater for great power competition at a moment when Beijing's strategic bandwidth is already stretched by its other regional and global commitments. Beijing will be using every channel available to it to get an accurate read on what is happening and to signal that it expects stability to be maintained. Russia, which has developed an increasingly close relationship with Iran over the past several years, a relationship deepened dramatically by the convergence of interests created by Western sanctions, is similarly invested in Iranian stability. Moscow has relied on Iranian military equipment in its conflict in Ukraine. It has relied on Iranian cooperation in Syria. A destabilized Iran is a complicating factor for Russian strategic planning at a moment when Russia can afford very few additional complications. Let us now turn to the scenarios going forward, because this is where analysis has to grapple with genuine uncertainty rather than pretending to a confidence that is not warranted. The first scenario, which we might call the managed resolution, involves the Iranian state successfully containing this crisis within its existing institutional framework. The designated successor either recovers from whatever has caused his absence, or the establishment quietly coalesces around an alternative figure in a way that is sufficiently rapid and decisive to prevent the appearance of chaos. State media eventually provides a narrative, illness and recovery, or a revised understanding of the succession path, that the domestic audience is expected to accept and that the international community cannot definitively disprove. The system demonstrates, once again, its remarkable resilience and its capacity for internal crisis management. This scenario is possible. The Islamic Republic has survived crises that outside observers believed would be terminal. It survived the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 years and killed hundreds of thousands. It survived the Green Movement of 2009, which briefly looked like it might genuinely threaten the government's hold on power. It survived the economic devastation of maximum pressure sanctions. Its institutional capacity for self-preservation should not be underestimated. The probability of this scenario depends significantly on something we do not yet know, the actual cause of the successor's disappearance. If it is a health issue, managed resolution is very likely. If it is a factional conflict, managed resolution is possible but requires the dominant faction to consolidate power quickly enough to prevent the appearance of contest. If it is external interference, managed resolution is more difficult because the Iranian establishment would face internal pressure to respond in a way that demonstrates that such interference carries costs, which creates its own escalatory dynamic. The second scenario, which we might call the extended ambiguity, involves the establishment being unable to resolve the question quickly. The designated succession path remains unclear for weeks or months. Different factions position their preferred candidates. The assembly of experts becomes a site of genuine contest rather than a rubber stamp for a decision already made in Khamenei's inner circle. The uncertainty this creates has immediate effects on the proxy network, on the nuclear program's management, and on the ability of Iranian diplomats to engage credibly with the outside world, because engagement requires knowing who will ultimately have authority over the commitments being made. This scenario is, in some ways, the most dangerous one from a regional stability perspective, not because it leads immediately to conflict, but because extended ambiguity creates conditions in which miscalculation becomes more likely. Adversaries may attempt to take advantage of perceived weakness. Allies of Iran may make independent decisions rather than waiting for Tehran's guidance. The proxy network, which functions as an extension of Iranian state power, becomes less predictable if there is genuine uncertainty about where authority in Tehran actually resides. The third scenario, and the one that intelligence agencies are modeling with the most concern, involves a succession that produces a leader who is significantly more hardline than his predecessor, a figure associated primarily with the Revolutionary Guard rather than the clerical establishment, someone whose worldview is shaped by the security apparatus rather than by theological scholarship, and who interprets the crisis of this moment as evidence that Iran has been too restrained in its external posture. This is not a hypothetical. There are figures within the Revolutionary Guard's leadership who have articulated, in contexts that were not designed for foreign consumption, a view of Iran's strategic situation that calls for a more aggressive posture, in the nuclear program, in the proxy network, in the willingness to use military force directly rather than through intermediaries. If the succession crisis produces a figure of that orientation in the Supreme Leader's office, the implications for regional security, for the nuclear negotiations, and for the broader balance of power in the Middle East would be severe. The fourth scenario, which is the most dramatic and the least likely but which cannot be dismissed entirely, is systemic crisis. A succession fight that becomes visible enough to the Iranian public, at a moment when economic grievances are already acute, could intersect with existing social pressures in a way that produces a political crisis of a different kind entirely. The Islamic Republic has faced mass protests before. It has always managed to suppress them. But a succession crisis is different from a protest movement triggered by a specific incident, because it goes to the heart of the system's legitimacy claim, the idea that the Supreme Leader governs with divine sanction and that the system as a whole represents the will of God as expressed through the Shia tradition. If that claim is visibly destabilized, if ordinary Iranians can see that the men who claim to govern on behalf of God are fighting among themselves in ways that look recognizably like any other power struggle, the corrosive effect on legitimacy could be significant. Not immediately fatal, but significant. And in a country where the underlying social conditions are already under strain, significant additional pressure on legitimacy is not a trivial matter. The question that hangs over all of these scenarios is one that is genuinely difficult to answer, which is why the silence coming out of Tehran is so disquieting to everyone who monitors this situation. The question is, what actually happened? What is the true cause of this disappearance? Here is the honest answer, the one that distinguishes serious analysis from confident-sounding speculation. We do not know. Not with certainty. And anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who presents a single definitive explanation as established fact at this point in time, is either working from information that has not been publicly corroborated or is performing a confidence they do not actually possess. What we do know is the structure of the situation. We know that the Islamic Republic is a system in which information is controlled with extraordinary discipline, and that the current information environment, characterized by the absence of official explanation, is anomalous in ways that merit serious attention. We know that the succession question is the most consequential political question in the Middle East. We know that multiple powerful actors, internal and external, have interests in how that question is answered. We know that Iran's system, for all its resilience, is not immune to the kinds of pressures that produce institutional crises in any state. And we know that the moment we are in, with Khamenei in declining health and the succession path suddenly unclear, is precisely the moment that those pressures would find their most concentrated expression. What we can say with confidence is that the days ahead are going to be extraordinarily revealing. The Islamic Republic cannot maintain total silence indefinitely. At some point, whether in days or weeks, there will be some signal, some statement, some controlled release of information that is designed to manage the narrative. The shape of that signal, what it says and what it conspicuously does not say, will tell analysts a great deal about what actually happened and what the establishment has decided to do about it. Watch the state media. Not for what it tells you, but for the pattern of what it covers and what it avoids. Watch the statements from Revolutionary Guard commanders. Watch whether senior clerical figures in COM begin to make statements that are slightly out of alignment with the official Tehran line. That kind of minor dissonance is often the first visible crack in a managed narrative. Watch the behavior of Iran's proxy network, particularly Hezbollah, which has consistently been one of the most sensitive indicators of the actual temperature inside the Iranian establishment. When Hezbollah's public posture shifts, it is almost always because something has changed in Tehran, not in Beirut. Watch the diplomatic signals. When governments begin to alter their diplomatic engagement patterns with Iran, postponing meetings, accelerating back-channel communications, repositioning assets, those behavioral changes carry information even when no statements are made. The Saudis, the Israelis, the Americans, the Europeans, all of whom have sophisticated monitoring operations focused on Iran, will be reacting to what they are learning. And their reactions will be visible to careful observers even when the underlying intelligence is not. This is what makes a moment like this one simultaneously so significant and so difficult to analyze in real time. The most important things are happening in rooms that have no cameras and no journalists. The decisions being made right now in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Tel Aviv, in Washington, in Beijing, will shape the trajectory of a region that has already experienced a decade of extraordinary upheaval. And the starting point of those decisions is a question that none of us can yet fully answer: what happened to Iran's designated successor, and where is he now? What we are watching, stripped of all the institutional language and theological framing, is a contest over who controls one of the most significant concentrations of political, military, and ideological power in the modern Middle East. And that contest is happening at a moment of maximum fragility for the system, maximum external pressure on the state, and maximum domestic stress on the population that the system governs. The Islamic Republic has always presented itself as a system guided by divine will rather than human ambition, by religious obligation rather than the ordinary mechanics of power. But what we are seeing now is the most human of political phenomena, the moment when a powerful system, built around a single source of supreme authority, confronts the unavoidable reality that authority does not transfer itself cleanly or without contest. Every system that has tried to manage succession, every empire, every monarchy, every one-party state, has discovered that this moment is the one its institutional architecture was least well designed to handle. Iran's Islamic Republic is discovering that too, in real time, in ways that the world is watching even if the world cannot yet see clearly. This is not the end of the Islamic Republic. Do not take this analysis to mean that the system is collapsing, because the kind of declaration has been wrong about Iran so many times before that making it again should require a level of evidence far beyond what is currently available. The Republic has survived, and it has survived things that looked more immediately threatening than this. Its institutional architecture, its coercive capacity, its ideological resources, and the genuine loyalty it commands among significant portions of the Iranian population, all of these factors argue for caution in predicting its demise. But something has happened. Something significant enough that the most information-controlled government in the region cannot find the words to describe it. Something that has caused the succession plan, the one that was supposed to guarantee the continuity of the Islamic Republic beyond its founding generation, to falter, publicly, at the worst possible moment. And when the silence finally breaks, when Tehran is finally forced to offer some account of what has transpired, the account it gives will itself be a piece of evidence. Because in a system like this one, the story a government tells about a crisis is always, in some measure, shaped by the crisis it is trying to manage. The explanation will reveal the problem it is designed to solve. And from that, those who are watching carefully will learn a great deal about the true nature of what has happened inside one of the most consequential political systems in the world. The question is not just what happened to Iran's designated supreme leader. The deeper question is what happens to Iran now. Stay with this story. Because whatever the answer turns out to be, it is going to matter, not just for the Iranian people, who deserve a future shaped by their own choices rather than by the political calculations of a narrow clerical establishment, but for every state in the region, and for every power beyond the region that has interests in what the Middle East becomes in the decade ahead. This is one of those moments that geopolitical historians look back on and identify as a hinge point. We may not know for years the full truth of what happened in those early morning hours in Tehran. But the consequences of it are already in motion. And the world is about to see what the Islamic Republic of Iran does when the plan it was counting on no longer works the way it was supposed to.